Before we can assess students' tests, projects, and cooperative work, we need to understand the difference between quantitative and qualitative analysis. Most people are comfortable with the quantitative part, or at least they think they are. So let's start there. Quantitative analysis really the numbers we assign to student work. Many people think of this as the right answer on the tests versus the total number of answers. So many people think of this as the mean or the average on a test. Dividing them gives you the mean, and most people, when they write their assessments in their grade books, that's what they put. Quantitative data doesn't have to come just from tests, however. We can also create quantitative data from rubrics when we assign students a score on a particular category between 1 and 5, let's say. By doing that, you're creating numbers that we're able to compare one student versus another. In addition to the mean, it is actually more useful for teachers to consider the mode and the range of any given assignment. The mean tells us the average. It lumps everyone together equally. That means that if one student gets an A+, she is pulling the average up of the students who got lower grades. Indeed, a couple A+s can even mask some troubling results for other students while also failing to recognize the superior work of the A+ students. Averaging them together might yield a perfect C grade. The mode and the range, on the other hand, tell us a lot about both the class as a whole and the individual students. The mode tells us the most common score. With this data, we can tell where most students in the class are on a particular assessment. The range alerts us to outliers. Those students who did either particularly well or particularly poorly on any one assignment. I'm going to notice that this is really, when we talk about either of these, on a particular assignment. None of these calculations should ever be used to pigeonhole a student into remedial or average or advanced categories. In our constructivist classroom, assessments serve as a benchmark for specific knowledge, skills, and dispositions, not general rules for foreseeing students' intelligence, whatever that means. I'd also like to point out here that when we're talking about quantitative data, there are two ways that we're looking at this, and we have to be really particular here. On some tests, and let's make that clear, you have some tests that actually, when we're doing the quantitative data, it's about actual answers. A student either gets it right or wrong. If you ask a short answer question, really what you're doing is assessing, or often what you're doing is assessing number of categories. So let's say I know in my short answer I want them to tell me X, Y, and Z, and they either did X, Y, or Z, and they gave me all three, or maybe they gave me two but not the third. So here, this is kind of a middle ground between the actual answers and what rubrics do, which is create numbers to assess evaluation. So I evaluate somebody's paper, and I say that they got a 3 out of 5 on one particular group. But that's not a hard and fast. This is really subjective here. So even when we say that we take a look at quantitative and we're adding these numbers, and it might look scientific. Not always really is it. A lot of times our numbers are subjective unto themselves. Maybe more important for classroom teachers, though, is qualitative data. Qualitative data provides us with an analysis of how students think about and through their work. For our purposes, the most useful qualitative evaluation techniques are a priori, meaning from the earlier, or already predefined, and open coding. And here we're saying themes arising from the data. These are both coding systems. This technique of coding involves teachers thinking about the types of themes students will really express, searching for those themes, and then re-examining the data for themes that the teacher missed or wasn't, those themes weren't in the original scheme. For example, let's take a look at an assignment that we might do. Let's save this for a second. Let's take an example of an assignment that I used when I taught middle school social studies. I asked, using as many of the attached primary sources as you deem appropriate, and I gave the students about 5. Describe the Battle of Yorktown in a 1-page essay. What I'm looking for are illustrations of student knowledge, skills, and dispositions or attitudes towards learning in this assignment. What I'm kind of looking for in the knowledge is 3 things. An account of Washington's movements and actions, an account of the French, and here we can even subdivide between ground forces under Lafayette and naval forces, and then an account of Cornwallis. I'm going to teach about the Battle of Yorktown. These are pretty much the 3 things that I need them to know when they walk out of my class. As for skills, I'm really interested in, 1, their ability to source. Really figuring out, using these primary sources, who wrote what, when, why, and then corroboration. As a social studies skill, it's really important for students to be able to look at multiple primary sources and figure out who's talking about the same thing, where there are contradictions, and why they might be. And then for dispositions, as a good social studies student, I'm really interested in trying to measure or assess how carefully they considered the text. So let's say I have the students do this assignment, and they all turn in their 1-page essays. There are a couple a priori codes that I know I'm going to try to find examples of in these essays and pull that data. So, for example, I want to look for something like Washington causing Cornwallis to retreat? I might look for something like timing of French forces coming to aid the colonial army. And I might look for a comparison of the British and colonial forces. I want you to take a look here. Causing, timing, comparison. All of these fit into our coherence analysis, or coherence coding that we talked about in the text-based discussions. Really what I'm looking for is not just that they know who Washington is, they know who Cornwallis is, they know the French were there, but really, do they know the relationships between all of these different pieces? That's the knowledge that I know I want them to get. For skills, I'm really interested that they know who wrote the primary sources that they talk about, when they were written, and for corroboration, I'm really looking for a comparison between different sources. Then finally, for dispositions, I might look for something like them talking about the most reliable or trusted source. As I read through all the different papers, what I do is I would note when students wrote something in each of these categories. So these are my a priori categories, right? Then on my piece of paper, as I'm noting, I'd write the student's name, and then exactly what they wrote for each of those categories. Then I take one more pass through the student's work to see any patterns that I might have missed that didn't fit into these categories. For example, when I did this one year, I noticed that students wanted to talk about Benedict Arnold. Even though, because he was written about in the textbook passage that I give them. But really, he's not a part of the story. So understanding why and how they talked about Benedict Arnold was really important for me understanding what was going on there in their minds. Now that I have all of my data organized, I can look at how the students wrote, demonstrating their knowledge, skills, and dispositions. Did they use lexical cues to express causation, timing, and comparison, or were they using something more implicit? Which ones were they using? Were they accurate? Did they say that something was caused by something else that really isn't true? Did they focus only on the army the source fought for, or did they explore all the data? Understanding this type of information would provide you, at least in this assignment, with a much more complex data set and much more complex view about what students learned and how you need to plan your instructional time as you move forward.